Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you for logging in for this session. I'm Nada from the marketing team over at Beamery, and I will be setting us up to get started on this presentation today. 3 ways to drive talent goals with AI. I have Sultan and Megan with me online, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in a second. But for now, I'm just gonna tell you a little bit about what we're gonna talk about, and then get through a couple of housekeeping items. So this session, as you guys probably know, is part of a series that we've been running for the past few weeks. It's the third session of the AI for Talent Transformation series that we've been organizing, and you can find recordings of the past 2 sessions in the Beamery website. And if you haven't yet, do make sure to register for the last session, which is going to be a panel in 2 weeks, and you'll find again more details in the on the Beamery website. If we could go through the next slide, Sultan, please. Thank you. So yeah, this is the third session of the series, and as I said, you can find recordings for the past sessions. And I did want to make sure to mention that we will be recording today's session as well. So if you have to drop out early, that's totally fine. You'll find the recording in your inbox tomorrow. I did also want to say, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please do send them in. There's a questions panel. There's a questions section in the GoToWebinar panel that you use to log in. So do send them in, and we'll have a break in the middle of the session to talk through some of those questions, and then we'll take questions again at the end of the session. So without further ado, I'll just move into the next slide and let our guests introduce themselves. Sultan, why don't we start with you?
Thank you, Nada, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this third part of the series. I'm Sultan Saidov, and I'm one of the founders at Beamery, where I run our product technology and customer experience functions. Megan, thank you for joining us. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm always excited to share information around applications of AI for HR. And that's my area of expertise and focus. Right now, I'm finishing off my PhD through Leeds University, and I'm also an industry analyst and researcher.
Well, we're excited to have you here, and I'll start with the first part of this session, and Megan and I will be doing a fireside for the second part of the session. And what I wanted to start with in talking about these 3 key use cases for AI is really one of the things that we see as the cause of a lot of paralysis in a lot of organizations when it comes to deciding where do we start with our AI journey. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of technologies and tools. What do we actually need for a meaningful result for our business? What actually improves our candidate experience? What actually adds value to our recruiters? How does it fit in with the technologies today? Ultimately, how do we link AI into our tools and processes to get meaningful business results rather than simply ticking a box that we've added some kind of AI experience? It also raised the question of what really is AI and what should we look for? Both in terms of what type of functionality adds the most value, but also what are the risks? What should we look out for in AI solutions? What are the considerations we have to know that we're ready to deploy them? How do we think about the change management involved? Ultimately, whether it's AI or not, or any kind of technology, it's only as useful as the experiences that it ultimately creates. And these are questions that are often challenging to answer in the very noisy environment that we live in talent and HR, and in the experiences that we're trying to create. So to guide through some of these topics that we encounter daily at Beamery, and we're fortunate to work with many of the world's biggest organizations and many of the Fortune 50, navigate these kinds of topics and conversations daily, in helping organizations craft talent, employee, and organizational experiences for their recruiters and folks across their business. And the top 3 areas I would say that we encounter where AI has the most meaningful applications and the most important questions to ask about how do we link it with business results today, especially in this post-COVID world where the only constant is change, and where there is so much transformation in how candidates think about their roles, where they work, what types of organizations they work in, when there's so many people leaving the jobs that they're in, and so many recruiting organizations having to transform their practices and candidate experiences and employee experiences. These are the three key buckets where we're starting to see really meaningful impact. The first of which is when it comes to recruiting experiences, it's not just about matching. In fact, matching is probably the wrong word to think about, but it's the word that has come up most often when people think about recruiting technology and job scoring and job matching. And the reason it's often the wrong starting point is because, firstly, the value of any AI is only as good as the underlying data that you have, and how meaningful the recommendations that can be made through AI are to your specific business and your specific organization. Every organization is unique in some way. The kind of candidates that you're hiring are likely to be different from the kind of candidates other organizations look for. And so you need to think about the ways in which the AI is going to amplify what your team is already doing and learn from, ideally, the practices that you have that make you successful and that define what does good look like, and how can we find AI technologies that help us replicate that success. And this starts with looking at data quality. I'll dive into this a little bit more, but it's one of the most valuable things across all industries that AI is starting to be used for is identifying data that hasn't been there before, and that's actually hard for any individual human being to process. It's been used to identify data patterns in every area from medicine to consumer technology, and is starting to make an impact on us identifying skill sets and identifying trajectories and identifying intent about candidates in a way that helps us not only prioritize who we speak to and when, and help us catch balls in the recruiting process, but also helps the AI be much more accurate and valuable in the way that it automates certain tasks and makes recommendations. And the next piece is around how can we use AI to simplify and replicate certain tasks. One of the things that we often don't notice in the most valuable AI experiences we have as consumers is how much of the value comes from AI being the new UI, the user interface. Apple, who are obviously one of the world's pioneering consumer technology companies, in their latest announcement a couple of weeks ago, had their biggest AI release do little more than reduce the number of notifications you get, reduce clutter. And it's a really meaningful impact, having more relevant notifications, having less noise. But it's not how you'd usually think about AI. People think about AI as adding something, not removing and simplifying something. And often removing things or replicating things that you'd otherwise have to do manually, and removing the need for you to do things manually, like search through things or see lots of noise, is an incredibly powerful application. And we'll talk about the way that also applies to candidate and employee experiences. The next is around suggestion and prioritization. Again, if you think about the consumer experiences that we have today, one of the biggest things that we're now used to is that almost all of our experiences are entirely personalized to us. No two people's Netflixes are the same, no two people's Facebooks are the same. And what these businesses do is reasonably simple. They look at the profile that's built around you through what you like and what you've spent time on, and personalize and prioritize. And in talent experiences, whether as recruiters, candidates, or employees, we're still using systems that are not personalized. We use either tracking tools or process tools that are built around administration. Candidates use websites. We haven't used websites for our consumer experience since the early 2000s. We now have apps. We have things that are portals and personalized to us. And so this element of personalization requires a different type of technology, something that isn't a system of administration, and thinking about how AI can fit into that technology and make things personalized across all of these stakeholders is really key. And on the candidate side, obviously candidate experiences aren't just about how candidates come to your brand themselves. It's also about the experiences you create through your interactions with candidates. There are really valuable ways of using AI to help you prioritize speaking to the right people at the right time, leveraging AI to find some of those patterns of behavior but also using AI to avoid speaking to people at the wrong time, avoid having multiple people in your team reaching out to the same person, being able to capture those signals around timing, and prevent people from being contacted unnecessarily. It's also about using AI in similar ways, again, to what we have in the world of consumer technology, to be smarter about what content we deliver and how that content, whether it's on a website, an email, an event, or a portal or an app style experience, can actually be dynamically adjusting to the candidate based on what they reveal about their interests and what you can identify through AI and inference about what that candidate's likely to be a fit for, whether it's a job or an event or a piece of content that will be valuable. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, in the time we're going through right now, it's easy to focus on being reactive and trying to plug holes with AI or any technology, trying to hire faster. And these things are important, but for pretty much every business around the world, one of the most important things is capitalizing on the amazing opportunity to leverage AI to both learn from what makes your business successful and learn from your employees and give them a better experience. One of the things that is interesting about the state of employee experience today is that there's very little visibility. It's hard to know where you are in your career, and it's hard to know what roles might be a fit for you. It's hard to know how to reskill or upskill. And these are things that AI has a very direct application to by looking at the high volumes of data about your organization and what career trajectories people have taken and what types of skills there are in your organization, and using inferences around this stuff. We can give employees a lot more transparency around what journeys they can take, and how they can actually self-direct their careers and explore their opportunities within their organization, and trigger the right conversations with their managers and look at the right learning courses, look at the suggested career paths. And I'll unpack again some of the parallels between that and some of the things that AI powers in consumer experiences and how direct that application is today. So with that, we'll start by going into each of these three areas in a bit more detail. And we'll start with the recruiting experience. And the image here is about obviously the US sports and basketball and how data-driven those are. And it's one of those analogies that we hear about a lot, the sort of Moneyball moments and the fact that everything is data-driven, but reality doesn't seem to be like that. It doesn't seem to be the case that we can suddenly have these accurate predictions about how good a fit somebody is. And AI seems to have been promising to say, hey, we're going to give you a perfect match score. So why is it that we haven't gotten there? Why don't we have these perfect systems that say this is a perfect candidate? And the systems that do claim it are often likely to be misleading unless there's an element of saying, well, how do we know that this is the right match score for your business, for your role? And this is where it comes down to two things that I touched on, which is, how do you know you have the right type of data about the types of candidates you're hiring, the types of things that your recruiters are doing, the types of things that are working for your business, in order for whatever AI you use to adjust its recommendations and results in a way that actually applies to you and to your success. And that starts with actually the number one problem, which is you often won't have that data. And one of the things that AI can help do is collect more information, clean it, standardize it, draw patterns of inference. There are AI technologies today that can look at your employee data and your high performers and the people you've retained, and look at patterns of those profiles to identify what types of skills do these people have, what types of experiences do they have, and can we find candidates that are similar to those employees, and recommend to recruiters, here are actually people that are similar to your high performers. You then have to think about how to do this in a way that actually isn't biased. And one of the key things around where AI can help is it can help transition the emphasis of what recruiters are focusing on towards things like skills, things that can be inferred and found through AI, and can help reduce the bias that often comes from looking at certain job titles or educations, which are often build from certain social backgrounds. And having a skill-based narrative can help recruiters focus their time, not only in a way that makes them more productive, but can often lead to reductions in bias. The other more basic things around where day-to-day tasks can be improved to make AI amplify our efforts when we're sourcing and recruiting candidates is looking at the day-to-day tasks from finding people, messaging them, and either making recommendations of which of those tasks to take first, or actually automating those tasks altogether. The word AI can often be misleading because it actually refers to a blanket term of anything that simulates human behavior. And there are really three distinct types of things that fall under that type of AI. The first of which is actually automation, which even if it's entirely rule-based, is often used under the moniker of AI. There are a lot of technologies out there that are simply rule engines, like chatbots and other automation systems. And even though they're not the same as true AI algorithms and machine learning and deep learning, they can still add a ton of value. And it's important to distinguish between automation and deep learning algorithms in terms of the value they add and how they can either do specific things that you expect versus infer things and do things that you haven't predefined. But it's also important to leverage rules. And actually, one of the things we're starting to see is more organizations using technologies that combine rules with machine learning, which is not rule driven, but is actually learning from the patterns of data you have to create something that's more personalized to your organization. For example, in the case of recruiting, you can have a rule that says every time that a candidate reaches this final stage, or every time that we make an offer, we want to use that as an example of the kinds of people we want to retarget in the future. So the rule is, once a candidate reaches an offer stage, and then the learning that comes off the back of that rule is train the systems to find profiles that are similar to that. So understanding that marriage between what is a rule and an automation versus what is going to be an algorithm, and using those two things together to help automate and replicate some of the successes you have is really important. The next thing is around how to leverage this kind of inference for better reporting, so you have better predictions around where you're heading. Again, to draw the parallel with the consumer parts of many businesses, there are a number of technologies that have been used over the past decade to start predicting and forecasting revenue, start predicting and forecasting shopping experiences and behavior. We're only now starting to see that apply to recruiter and candidate and employee experiences, but there's a lot of inferences and forecasts that can be made around your talent pipeline and how likely it is to convert, that can look at other dynamics outside of your business, like market supply and demand, and give you predictions around risk of how likely you are to hire certain people, how at risk certain roles are, and starting to look at AI that can help you make those decisions. That isn't just about looking at the immediate day-to-day behaviors of open jobs, but is actually looking forwards into what are we not thinking about, where are we at risk, how can we make predictions around the future of our pipeline, and then focus our efforts on the areas where the AI is inferring risk or inferring priority. So on the candidate experience side of things, we have, again, the image here is the parallel to that Netflix personalization. We have a number of very easy opportunities to use AI to start treating candidates like customers and to create these types of experiences that are much more akin to customer experiences. These types of AI for the consumer experiences are also shifting the goalposts for what candidates expect. Candidates aren't out there putting on their customer hat and thinking, I'm now expecting a fantastic frictionless experience on Netflix and recommendation, and then taking that up and putting their candidate hat on and saying, okay, now I'm ready for a completely unpersonalized application that will take me a couple of hours. The goalposts are shifting and candidates are starting to expect experiences that are more consumer-like. And the question is, what does that personalization look like, and what's the path to get there? What's the path to make the inbound experiences that candidates have, so when they find our website, when they interact with us, smarter, more personalized, and more akin to a consumer experience? And what does it look like in terms of the outbound side, when our team is reaching out to people, sourcing them, or responding to them applying for jobs and signing up to our events, or keeping in touch with people who are alumni? More and more organizations need to think about the candidate experience for alumni and how to retarget those people in a way that is personalized. You don't want to reach out to an alumni as if they've never been at your company. That's not going to impress them. Keeping track of the kind of data you have in your business is the first part before you even get to AI. But then the second part is using AI to get additional data points that help you make that experience more personalized, and using AI tools that are built around personalization, things that create portal-like experiences for candidates that move away from websites towards things that push certain types of content. There are new technologies that are starting to create these types of personal experiences for candidates to self-direct themselves see potential career paths, see potential recommended content that dynamically adjusts based on which roles they're looking at or what events they've attended. And the same for messaging. We're moving more and more into a world where the types of content that you send to candidates can be dynamically adjusted with AI-based intelligence and inference around what type of content has resonated before, what type of emails have candidates engaged with, based on the information we have about the candidate and what events they've attended or what content they looked at on our career site or which recruiter they spoke to. How can we start personalizing the experience for them with those pieces of information in mind? And that's the kind of true personalization that is within reach for every organization within the next couple of years. If we start looking at AI technologies that mirror those consumer experiences and allow us to think about treating candidates like customers. And similar to the candidate journey and some of what allows us to create personalization, the employee experience has a specific nuance. And one of the parallels that I think is quite appropriate to thinking about where AI can help with employee experience is thinking about where we've come to in the last 20, 30 years as we've started getting products like Google Maps. Before products like Google Maps, when you had to just look at a map, you have all the information around the locations where you could go, but your first question is, where am I? You have to start by figuring out where on the map you are. And then your next question is, okay, I can find where I want to go, but what are my routes? Which of these routes might have traffic? Which of these routes might be closed? That type of information gap is very similar to what employees find themselves in when they're thinking about navigating careers, upskilling, reskilling, potential paths. Your first question is, where am I today? What skills do I have in my business? How well do I understand the opportunities that are available to me? How well do I understand my opportunity to shift careers within my business? We see so many surveys that say it's easier for people to find a job externally in almost every company than to find roles internally. And we have the opportunity to create that sort of transparency and leverage AI to help us pull together this information and present it and surface it to employees. We can look at AI that infers skills from roles and job titles. We can look at AI that helps us provide potential career paths and find patterns in career paths. We can look at AI that helps match employees to other employees that might be mentors and to people they can speak to. We can look at AI to help businesses actually see what their business looks like, what skills they have in their business, where they might have gaps, where they need to lean into learning programs. So these are really crucial things that we can use AI to help point us to. So why does the use of AI and the impact of AI on talent mobility in particular matter? Well, this goes back to what I touched on in terms of the time that we're going through. Of course, all of these things, recruiter experience, candidate experience, employee experience, are important. But what we're seeing now in this, I've heard many people start referring to this year as the Great Resignation. We're starting to see this specific gap be one of the most important opportunities, not only because employees are starting to consider other opportunities, but because if you're trying to recruit, it's only going to be effective if the people that you're recruiting stay. And if you've managed to create the right environment in this fast-paced and crazy time that we're entering, to actually hire the kind of people that are going to stay in an environment where people might be leaving more than usual. I spoke to one Fortune 500 CHR very recently who referred to their organization managing to meet all of their DE&I recruiting targets, but actually ended up with less diversity in the business because they weren't able to retain those diverse employees. And these are challenges we see every day, because no matter how effectively you recruit, you have to be able to create the right transparency and the right processes and the right culture internally to retain the employees. And it's a fantastic application of the kind of AI technologies that are starting to become available to give employees that visibility and transparency that can significantly increase the likelihood of employees to stay within the business and see that growth and look at internal opportunities rather than leave due to lack of transparency or lack of visibility, which is such a common cause. And part of that is about connecting the dots between different things that your business is likely to be already doing in terms of thinking about learning pathways and what LMS systems you might be using, or what type of roles might be worth letting people speak to, even if they aren't currently open. Connecting data that lets employees see jobs that might open in the future and who they could speak to about those. Data that shows people what types of courses might match to their specific development paths. We see companies where people are trying to move from customer-facing functions to engineering functions and vice versa. So how do you give people the visibility into what type of skill trajectory that sort of leap would take, and what types of transitions happen? We see companies with people who are doing front office work, even though they have PhDs and skill sets that would be relevant in lots of other more technical roles in their business. So giving people the option of these trajectories are available and letting them find and navigate these conversations, so that ultimately we can help use AI to fix this problem of employees not feeling as lost in their careers, knowing where to turn. And I think the stats that we're starting to see right now around how many employees are considering leaving and struggling with this transparency are staggering. It is significantly higher than it's been for any time in the past couple of decades. Recently, as you can see here, it says we found 57% of employees have considered leaving their jobs in the last 12 months. And the strategy to do this isn't just about throwing in an AI tool. It requires thinking about the way to drive change management across your business, and to consider using both AI and data insights in a couple of areas. And we see this as having three core facets to an AI-powered talent mobility and employee strategy. The first is looking at the types of roles that your business is hiring for, and the way that your business has thought about their workforce plan, and the sequence of core jobs and roles and job families that are being recruited for or being planned for, and looking at that through the lens of skills rather than simply job titles, and looking at that through the lens of in what scenarios are there actually employees that could grow into those roles rather than us having to hire externally, looking at that through the lens of what types of roles are going to be transferable. Where can we have things that are trainable versus things that we have to hire for directly? Building an inventory of what that looks like for your business today by understanding what skills our employees have. And AI has some great applications in helping you paint that picture and infer some information rather than simply relying on employees saying what skills they have, which few employees would know how to say without some support. And that's the third part, using AI technology that can help provide that support, that can help prompt employees to think about what they want to learn or what skills they have. And using AI as a driver of experiences that engage employees with submitting that kind of information about their interests and their trajectories, and that learn from what type of content they're looking at, what types of jobs they're looking at, and what types of learning pathways they're interested in, and then feed that back to help the business see some statistics around where their business is heading and the state of the skills in their business. So with this, there's a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of things to think about. And going back to something I said at the beginning, where do we start and what needs to be true for some of these technologies to make a meaningful impact in business results? And I think there's, as a first and important starting point, the question around how do you look at the people in your business that are going to be part of the change management for this, and part of the people that are going to be evaluating this, not just through the lens of features, but through the lens of outcomes and the lens of who in our business is going to be taking part in rolling out these technologies. You have to also start by looking at this point of underlying data. Do we have the right foundations in place for certain types of AI technology? There is value to be had from using AI, no matter what state of maturity you're at with your data and business processes. But depending on what types of systems you have in place and how you track your data, you would want to start with different types of AI journey. For example, if you don't have a way of centrally tracking all of your candidates and interactions and having the kinds of AI technologies that help you keep that data clean and compliant, then a good starting point would be looking at technologies that focus on data cleanliness, technologies that focus on integrations, but also looking at more simplistic AIs that, for example, would drive candidates into looking at certain jobs, or drive candidates into certain automated experiences. And once you have certain foundations in place around creating cleaner data and trusting that the recommendations that are going to be coming through the AI are more personalized, you can look at more sophisticated systems that can combine those rules, like who did we hire, with intelligence that learns from those rules, and that provides you with safeguards around things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. Once you have certain ways of reporting in place of is AI helping us remove bias or leading to more bias, it can be the right time to start rolling out more sophisticated strategies. So it boils down to creating a pathway and thinking through the sequence of what types of technologies and tools you want to put in place. And that allows you to think about being accountable to the outcomes and focusing on the initiatives that drive the highest value without creating certain risks upfront. So with that, I will pause and take any questions from all the folks in the call before we move on to the next part of my conversation with Megan.
Thanks, Sultan, and thanks, Megan, for listening in. I did have a couple of questions. I think one of them we could address right now. So the question is, where does AI have the highest impact today, specifically any low-hanging fruits? And my understanding is that because, Sultan, you addressed these three areas where AI can have an impact, and so many of them seem valuable, it might be a good place for people to start to kind of wrap their mind around where the lowest hanging fruits are, where they can go look for quick wins if they're just starting in this AI journey and they want to showcase results quickly, for example.
Yeah, of course. So I think the starting point is which area in your business is most important in terms of a quick win. Because you can have quick wins in all of the things I talked about: employee experience, recruiter experience, candidate experience. So to start with, which of those do you have a bigger challenge with? And I would also not just think about it as an AI quick win, but as a broader what is the experience improvement we're trying to create. With that in mind, I will give an example of a quick win in all three areas. On the candidate experience side, a quick win would be looking at AI that helps personalize the candidate journey, whether it's on your careers website to be a little bit smarter, or something that you can add into your career site, like a talent community or a portal that can be more AI driven and not just about candidates browsing things. So that's an easy win. And also looking at the way that you send outreach, looking at AI that helps your team personalize the outreach, grade your jobs, grade the content, and look at some of the ways you can learn from the insights from AI to help improve the experience that you're creating and the kind of content you're creating. On the recruiter side, I think one major quick win is looking at AI that infers data and gives you insights. So not just looking at it simply matching things, but giving you more information. The AI that says, here's some behaviors we're spotting, and here's some intent scores. AI that says, we've inferred these types of skills or capabilities. AI that can augment the data you have, because it's going to allow your team to just be more efficient about the things they're already doing, like searching for candidates, sourcing candidates. Of course, it also helps to look at AI that can improve your interviewing process or improve your candidate scoring. But you also have to be thoughtful around how to deploy that in a way that actually doesn't do more harm than good. You don't want the team, your team, assuming that AI is suddenly going to be accurate and more accurate than what they've been doing before. So with that point of caution in mind around how do we make sure it's used correctly and not assumed to be an accurate score, and focusing on things that aren't trying to just give scores but trying to give insights is a good way of doing that. And then on the employee experience side, I think it's ultimately looking at products that do this type of transparency and personalization and these types of career path mappings. The extent to which it's a quick win will depend on the maturity of your business and whether you already have internal processes and experiences that have to be taken into account in order to roll this out effectively and engage employees. But there are lots of opportunities, whether it's on the job matching or exploration side for employees, or in terms of how you match people to learning and content, that can be really powerful wins, and if thought through correctly, can be deployed quickly.
Thank you. I think that answers the question pretty broadly. That covers the whole breadth of what you talked about. I think we'll hold the other couple of questions for the next section because I think they have a little bit of a relationship with what you guys will be discussing. So I'll just let you get on with the next section of this presentation.
Thanks, Nala. And we'll now move on to something I started hovering around, which is the considerations around risks. And I think in particular, a big risk is how to think through the ethics of using AI. So thank you, Megan, for joining us today and talking through some of the considerations. And I guess we'll start with this first question that we see a lot, which is there an increased awareness of risks that come with AI in HR? How are people looking at the landscape of risks and understanding them? So Megan, what do you see on this?
That's a great question. I think, interestingly enough, a few years ago, there was comments in the industry around HR not adopting AI fast enough. And my argument was back then that there was a healthy hesitation and that there was a lot of unclear information in the market. And I think over the last few years, as we've seen more cases come to light, both mainly in the mainstream media about AI not doing what it's expected, or increasing bias, or doing other things that weren't intended, obviously, that there is a healthy hesitation. But at the same time, there's also a realization that there's also a lot of benefit. So how do we move forward with an understanding of the risks, and also being also taking advantage of the opportunities? We're also seeing, I think the big thing is that the lack of regulation is making it challenging for the market. And as we see more regulations starting to come, or suggested guidelines have been coming out over the last few years, the EU this last year has now put out their recommendation and guidelines, which will be coming clearer over time. And we see in there, like, HR is considered high risk when we're making decisions about a person's livelihood and employment journey. We have to take it seriously. And as you mentioned in your presentation before, Sultan, there's like, how are we using this technology? Because it's not just about the data that we use, or the data that we captured, or the algorithm, but it's also like the context of the use, who's using the tool, a matching algorithm given in the hands of a recruiter versus given to the employee. Those are two different contexts for the same tool, and that would change the considerations that we need to think about when we're adopting or implementing a tool or application in our processes. So if we're thinking about this, it's the healthy hesitation. As more regulations come out, it's going to make it clear. It's going to help standardize the market as well. We also have the lack of industry best practices, which are starting to emerge in the last few years, and it helps people understand. And the beginning of your presentation, you highlighted some of the great areas where AI has been shown to be helpful and help us. But we need more of those. A lot of HR professionals, understandably, want that case study, that information in front of them that says, yes, this is going to work here. It can be very challenging to go into a situation where you're the first to do it. And in some organizations, they're very happy to embrace that. But in most organizations, HR practices, they take their employees seriously, and they're more hesitant and less risk averse. But I think we're seeing that as regulations are coming, as the industry best practices are starting to standardize themselves a little bit, the awareness of risk is there, but also the awareness of how to mitigate risk or how to control risk is also becoming available, and we're seeing more of that happening, which I think is going to help us with the adoption of AI overall.
And you mentioned obviously the emergence of certain best practices, and some businesses starting to tackle this head on, especially ahead of this increased focus from a regulatory perspective. Are there any examples of either business best practices or businesses that have helped create an increased awareness around how they're approaching AI that are helping shape how the industry is thinking about this?
That's a great question. I personally work on and have found other people in the industry that are also taking this approach and going with a risk-based approach. So understanding that in our decisions that we're making already in HR, that there's a certain level of risk. So if we have a person making a decision or doing something, and that there's a certain level of risk associated with that, and then we have a technology come in, and we're going to measure the risk associated with that, and compare it, and show that we're improving it. There's also other ways to do risk assessments. I have my 7 dimensions of AI ethics to think about. So the impact that the application that we're seeing, the impact that it's having on jobs, the responsibilities, and to the quality of the job, so the person using it, The data, of course, privacy, portability, use, right to be forgotten, and actual informed consent, because we're seeing a lot of data being either collected inappropriately without a proper consent, or passive data that's already been collected being repurposed. The effectiveness and misuse of an algorithm. So not just, as I mentioned before, the context. So if we're using a matching algorithm and it's being used by a recruiter versus being used by a job candidate to find jobs that match them. So is there an opportunity for misuse when a recruiter is using it? And how effective is it? And then of course, accountability and liability. And then what we've heard a lot about in the AI arguments for the last few years is around explainability and transparency. So how can we actually explain what an algorithm is doing, and how can we share with other people and users? So for an example, if we have a candidate and they want to ask a question about, well, why was this decision made the way it was, or how was my resume interpreted, that we're able to show that. And then of course bias, and that is bias is such a difficult challenge, because even if we're able to control for issues within data or an algorithm, sometimes we could be introducing new bias in without intending to. And then of course with HR, we always have to be aware of notification and accommodation. So are there situations where an application could impact a person unfairly because of a disability or because of any other protected reason? And we always have to be aware of that. So when we're going into this, there's been a lot of conversations, and as I say, my personal approach is through the risk-based approach. So understanding where are the areas of risk and how are we going to mitigate and control for them.
And as one of the risks you just called out, specifically around the risk of bias and how it might occur, I think touches on some of the ethical implications as well, in terms of learning from candidate behavior. And that's obviously something that has had similar connotations in the consumer world of products that have been learning from consumer behaviors. So what are some of the ethical implications specifically around candidate behaviors and AI systems that learn from it?
Awareness is a big consideration. And I think when we're looking at the difference between de-pseudonymized and anonymized consumer data, where we have, for example, footfall traffic, very easy to monitor footfall traffic going into a store. We're not able to identify, even though we can guess some things about a foot and the gait of a person as to their gender and age, we can't tell who that person is. But if we put that same technology into an office space with 20, 200, or even 2,000 people, that starts to change it. And we start to get into situations like where we see in Amazon, where they're using AI to monitor employees in the workplace and how they move around in the warehouse. So we can have this collecting of data where people are unaware of it. And if you think about it, it's like, it's not just in a warehouse with people moving around. It can even be collecting data on people, including social media data. Have they updated their LinkedIn profile? And it could be used as an indicator that they're about to churn from their job. And these are unintended data. People don't realize that they're creating this data. And that's where we're starting to get into some questionable ground, particularly with HR and organizations, because we already know that we're not supposed to be tracking and surveillance, inappropriate surveillance on employees. And we've seen that with the H&M fine that came out, I want to say it was 2021, but I almost have a feeling it was 2020 now. I think we're allowed to all minus a year out of our lives after this last year. But anyways, their fine, 32 million pounds, 35 million euros. Like, yes, they weren't using AI, but it was the collection and application of inappropriate data and data about employees to make and connecting it with sales data. So when we're collecting information about our employees, we definitely have to be cautious. And that's where it comes into as well, into the notification, because there can be ways that you can make people aware of the data that's being collected. So we do see products that do collect data, for example, of employees moving around the office, but they're very aware of it. They're literally wearing a badge that they've agreed to wear anonymously to understand how people move around an organization or an office space. And that's very different to collecting data that somebody's kind of putting out there that they don't realize, versus collecting data on a person and they don't realize it and they don't know that you're collecting it, and you're basically spying on the person. And that's when we get into some of these big privacy issues. And we see the same argument coming out around facial recognition technology, and in the UK that has been very controversial with the police. Is it fair for police to have a van sitting on the side of the street and just be scanning everybody's face, knowing that they're more likely to pull somebody over and flag somebody who is completely innocent? And in the UK, that's really been pushed out the door and said, no, that's not cool. The EU has also said that they're not going to get involved in certain behaviors like that. So I think that there's, in HR, we always need to be very careful about what data are we collecting on people. Are they aware of it? And should we be collecting it? And simply, sometimes I think the answer is no, we shouldn't be collecting it.
Well, I think this takes us maybe to the next question that we have here, which is when we think about what data we shouldn't collect, what else should employers be thinking about in terms of protecting their candidates' rights, similar to what you're saying around protecting candidates' rights to the kind of data that's exposed and collected? What other things should employers think about in terms of protecting rights when it comes to providing better experiences?
That's a great question. So not just collecting the data, but really being aware about who in the organization is seeing it and what are they using that data for, or the insights collected from that data. So if we have something, an assessment from the recruitment process, does the hiring manager really need to see the score of that? Is that going to impact their evaluation of that person later on in their employment journey, negatively or positively? So it's very much, so what is the data we're collecting? Who should be using it and working with it? If we are going to keep it, or is it de-pseudonymized or anonymized in a way that we're able to use it in aggregated formats, because it can be helpful? And also, what is the employee's awareness of the information that's being collected on them, how long it's being stored for, and what their rights are, such as the right to be forgotten? How are they able to go about and actually ask to have that done? So that's part of the notification process.
And it sounds like obviously there's a lot of organizations have to think about when it comes to managing compliance, rights to be forgotten, protecting what data is being asked for and how it's being deleted. What does this mean for the people that are on the front lines of working with candidates, the recruiters? Are they themselves at risk?
Well, unfortunately, to an extent, yes. Of course, the organization is going to take the bigger blow than the individual. But with data and more data being used and data-driven decision-making, people are now calling it more into question, and we're able to track how decisions are being made and the types of data being used. So that means more people are likely or have the opportunity to question it and bringing it up into tribunals or courts, depending on which country you live in. So as people become more aware of this and the fact that their data could be misused or that something could have gone wrong and they're able to ask questions about it, it of course creates more risk for people doing it. And also, of course, the more data we collect and the more information we have about people is going to put us more at risk for using it. And the best way to help with that is documentation. Documenting what data is being used in the decision-making process, and ensuring that the process is transparent both internally and to externally, but in a situation where you could go back later on a decision that was made and you can show this is the data we used, this is why we made the decision the way we made our decision.
It's I think that definitely a lot to think about. It goes back to what I was saying earlier around the question of quick wins and where to start. Has to start with not just the tool, but the behavior and how you think about the training and the change management. Even if it's very lightweight, it has to be thought out and started with the right point for what an organization is ready for and the kind of change management they're ready for. So thank you for running through that, Megan. That was a lot of really important information. I think with that, we'll pass back to our audience here if anybody else has any questions.
Thanks, Sultan. We did have one earlier question that I thought we could keep until now. And the question was about evaluating tools that have AI features. And specifically, what are some questions that you should ask when you're looking at tools? And I think it would be really interesting to answer that question while also taking into consideration the ethical perspective and the risk and so the transparency perspective, because as recruiters and talent teams are also becoming held accountable more often for these decisions, I think it is the question that is probably going to be asked more often as talent teams look at new tools and new solutions.
Absolutely. Well, Megan, I think it might make sense for you to start with your perspective around what are the ethical risks with technologies that people might choose, and how to look at it.
Yeah, after evaluating so many products over the years, I think the biggest first thing is for people to really understand what they need. What are you trying to do with the technology? A lot of products can offer kind of like the bells and whistles that can become distracting easily. And it can seem like a great idea at the time, but later on you're kind of like, oh, it doesn't really solve the problem that we actually had. People aren't using it the way we expected to, so it becomes shelfware. So I think the very first stage of selecting the right product is really knowing your use case and what you're actually using technology for. And I think the second thing is going in and unfortunately, there's been a bit of, I would say, misuse of the term AI and also HR terminology as well in the industry, where we see a lot of products. I guess like the best way to put it is they don't do what the package claims they do. So really understanding what is the AI doing in the product? What data is being collected? Is it passive data that already exists within your HRIS systems? Are you collecting new data? How is that data being collected? And then, of course, how the algorithm is working and how decisions or recommendations are being made from it. That, of course, is when we're talking about insights. So algorithms that are doing something like skills inferencing versus when you're doing something like purchasing a chatbot that's going to be asking, answering frequently asked questions on your job site. Of course, that's going to be slightly different. You're going to be looking for a product that works best for your organization. So when we're looking at that, it depends on, of course, what product you're looking at and what you're doing. But if you're looking at one that's creating the insights, really understanding the data and the algorithm is going to be vital to using the product appropriately later on.
I think you've covered that very in great detail, and covered some things I'd add as well there. I think on our side, to your point around there being lots of different misnomers around AI, I think transparency isn't just important in how the AI operates and the explainability. It's also important in terms of unbundling both the use cases and what type of AI it is. As I mentioned earlier, the term is by its nature all-encompassing, including covering rules, machine learning, deep learning, and lots of very different types of technologies with different types of values and risks. So I think looking at vendors that help you understand the true difference and how it works. The previous session in this 4-part series was touching on this topic. It's important to look at white box and not black box. White box where people provide explainability both in how the AI works. I think a red flag would be organizations that say, well, it's IP, we can't tell you how the matching works, etc. I think that's dangerous, both in the bias it might create and in the way that it helps organizations think through their evaluation, change management, and risk management. Nada, do we have any other final questions?
No, I think we're good for now. So thank you both, Sultan and Megan, for answering the question so thoroughly.
Thank you all for joining.
Yeah. So sorry about that. So we are at time. I just want to remind everyone who's listening in that we will be sending a recording of this session, and you can also find a recording of the previous sessions that Sultan just mentioned on the Beamery website. So yeah, again, thank you, Sultan. Thank you, Megan. Thank you for everyone who's joined and listened in. And if you haven't yet, please do check out the last session of this series. It's going to be a super interesting panel with Madeline Lorano, founder of Attitude Research, as our host, and 3 panelists. I will let you discover who they are on the Beamery website. But I look forward to seeing you all there. And yeah, I think everything that's left to say is thank you again and see you for the next one. Thank you, Sultan. Thank you, Megan. Bye.